Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I want to address something that's been part of both the game and the rulebooks, as far as I'm aware, since they started coming out. And it's been a frustrating limitation, and a subject of a lot of rather heated debate at certain tables and LARPs that I've attended, so I figured this would be a good topic to cover, particularly for people who may not have thought about it all that much, or who have just sort of taken it as writ that this is the way things are. And of course, I'm talking about the Stereotypes section that you find in basically every World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness game. For those who may not know what I'm talking about, or who may have just skipped past it and it didn't really register in your brain, in basically every book, aside from the Mortals book, there's what's called the Stereotypes section of it. It's just a list of what certain types of supernatural creatures think about other types of supernatural creatures within the game. And it's meant to sort of give players and storytellers a quick frame of reference of what are the cultural assumptions that come with certain types of creatures, or even within a book, different varieties of the same creature. For quick and dirty example, if you're playing a Werewolf the Apocalypse game, people will assume that the Get of Fenris tend to be large, violent, and have a decent chance of being really racist. The Silverfangs, they're haughty, they're arrogant, and their time has passed, they're in decline. Broad, sweeping stereotypes. Same thing with Vampire. If you see someone who is just covered in weaponry and seems to be here to throw down, probably a Bruja. If you see someone who is here to throw down but is not covered in weaponry and looks a little savage, probably a Gangrel, and so on and so forth. And a lot of the times these are just earmarks. They're occasionally just aesthetics. There's no in-game requirement, there's no mechanical thing that says you have to X, Y, or Z. These are just quick and dirty references for everyone to immediately get a hold of what things are going to look like, how things are going to act or behave under normal circumstances. But a lot of the time, we as players, we as storytellers, because our brains like neat little boxes, will just take the stereotypes and just decide that's the way things are, that's now a fact of the setting, and we will actively argue against things that go against these stereotypes, even if there's no rules in place that say you have to X, Y, or Z to be this type of creature, to be part of this type of community, and so on and so forth. And that often artificially limits our choices, and it can be very frustrating both as a player and as a storyteller when people make assumptions and then insist that those assumptions have to be factual. A good example of this for folks who haven't read the article I did on this subject a little while ago is a thing that I had fun with at a vampire LARP several years ago that I like to use as an example of, because it's a LARP, there was a lot of costuming involved, there was lots of full acting, full character on display, and it was a thing I like to do if I like to change up these stereotypes, I like to play with assumptions. And so I had a character that folks know, it was Christopher Blood was the name of the individual, because it's just punny. But, so he shows up, hair out, sunglasses, cigarette, leather jacket, gun under either shoulder, very aggressive, he was a road captain, he was in charge of a motorcycle gang. And everyone who took a look at that character immediately assumed I was playing a Bruja. And it's a room of 20-30 vampire players, many of whom are very experienced players. They've seen lots of things come and go over the years. And everyone had that moment of assumption. And all of them were wrong. Because despite his aesthetic, despite the way he behaved, despite the way he did business, Christopher was a Ventru. Obviously because his master had been a Ventru, but the reason that he conducted himself this way is he was a pirate. Back in the Gilded Age of piracy, that was the trade that he knew. As Hans Gruber was told, you might use a fountain pen, I might use a gun, but it's still business all the same. And that was actually calling back to a statement in one of the books for Vampire of some Ventru will wear business suits and conduct themselves as CEOs. Others will wear leather jackets and run motorcycle gangs, but they're still in charge. They are still the king in the setup. And it was sort of a social experiment that I wanted to do of people who had taken the stereotype of the game so far that they had even ignored text in the book we were playing with that said this was not a universal truth. And it's something that once you think about it, once you look at it, once you start to analyze it, it can lead you to a lot of fun ideas and a lot of interesting subversions and inversions. But it does come with a caveat that I also want to talk about and warn people against, and it's what I refer to as just the inverted stereotype. And this is what you get when you take a stereotype of a certain type of character or a certain, even if we were playing a different game, if it was a certain class, and you just take all of the sliders and you move them to the other end of the scale. At that point, you're just inverting everything without asking why you're inverting it. You're just playing the opposite of the standard stereotype, which ends up becoming its own stereotype in another way. To really invert stereotypes, to really subvert them, what you need to do is look at what makes the core of this type of creature or this particular part of the culture and keep those pillars, but express them in a different way or do something differently with them. As a good example, if you wanted to play an unexpected gangrel, since vampire seems to be a really easy example to reach for, of you might have your typical example of this is a character who is very feral, very bestial, and they have that very monstrous aspect to them. But what if you wanted someone who was an urban beast rather than a rural one? How would that display? How would you be different? What things would you alter? And it's not just the sense of what animal do you pattern yourself off of, but what is your behavior? What are the rules that you know? What are I suppose, the patterns that you follow? Or if you wanted to, say, play a unexpected artiste amongst the vampires. It depends on which genre we're doing. It might be a deva, it might be one of the toreador. But they're usually thought of as foppish, or they have the tendency of laying about and just making art, or being very what's the word? They tend to be very full of themselves as far as their own importance and the brilliance of what they're working on. But these are also characters who get access to the full range of very physical disciplines, the very physical powers. So if you have a character who is an artist or is expressing themselves through a more traditional medium that way, they might not be a painter or a sculptor or a poet. They might be a fencer. So you have someone who can move faster than the eye can see, who can enhance their strength, who can enhance their durability. It doesn't mean that the art that they practice isn't martial. And that's an interesting inversion, but at the same time, you can also keep that idea of a character who is devoted to expression in a way that perhaps they thought they had mastered while they were still alive, and now that they've been undead for a couple hundred years, they are just terrifying with. And this is something you can just take and go through basically every other example of a World of Darkness game, of whether it's a Promethean who doesn't quite fit what you think they would based on their type, whether it's a changeling who doesn't have the different earmarks that you expect. For example, you might have an ogre who seems to be physically weak, and that just it was part of their durance. The cruelty was they were not allowed to eat. They had to fight for everything they wanted. So even though they may not have the hulking appearance one expects, even though they might be quiet in their demeanor, it doesn't mean that at their core they don't have that inherent cruelty that makes one an ogre in Lost. And it's just something to think about when we're planning our characters, when we're looking at things we want to do, and when we're looking at the stories we want to tell. It's important not to feel beholden to these ideas of, well, this is the way it's traditionally done, so this is the way we have to do it, if there's no mechanical rule that says you must have X, Y, or Z. But at the same time, it's also important to ask, why are we changing this aspect? What are we hoping to do that is different with it? What are we subverting with our expression of this character? And this goes not just for players, but also for storytellers. Whether it's you want to, have a character who is traditionally thought of as brutish or thuggish, and you want them in a position of power. Is that them playing into the stereotypes so that people underestimate them? Are they actually far craftier than people think? Or are they exactly as brutish as people think, and there's someone pulling their strings from behind the throne? Could your players in this chronicle rise to that level of the wicked vizier, who, for all intents and purposes, are the ones running things, even though they're not the ones sitting on the throne? These are questions to keep in mind, and these can be interesting when it comes to the answers, because a lot of the time we just kind of take what we're given and we run with it. But I will end it by repeating something I said earlier of aesthetic is not a thing that you should enforce, especially if the aesthetic doesn't have a deeper meaning. Because a lot of the time, the way we express ourselves and just the appearance we have can catch a lot of people's brains of they decide this looks wrong based on what I'm assuming should be here, and it makes us be bothered. And a lot of the times we will push back on that for no reason, when if we just embrace it, especially if it doesn't go against any of the actual rules, it can lead to some really interesting expressions of character and some very memorable moments in game, both from both sides of the table. And so it's worth thinking about. It's worth incorporating into your own games. If you think about it and you realize you've just kind of been following the paint by numbers guide, maybe you want to go outside the lines a bit, see what it does. Start small. Change one thing is my usual recommendation, and just follow the ripples for how that thing goes, whether it's the assumed ethnicity that comes with a certain type of character, or the culture that they grew up in, or even just, this character's gender presentation. Change that up and see where it goes. And you might find that while you're no longer the stereotype, you are still very much a member of a certain supernatural community when you open up the hood and look at the engine inside. But that's all I have for this week. I wanted to keep things a little short. I have a follow-up for this I'll be discussing in the future, and hope you all enjoy. Before I head out this week, remember, leave comments below if there's a topic you want to see me cover. Check the link in the description if you're interested in seeing some of my own World of Darkness and Chronicles of Darkness books. And till next time, happy gaming, everyone.